Okay, welcome everyone. My name is John Owens. I work in the library at the Fauquier campus of Lord Fairfax. And the class that I'm going to be giving you guys today is called Leadership Lessons Through History. So what I wanted to do with this class was give you guys some qualities that I've found amongst leaders in American history that I think everybody should aspire to when they're put in a leadership position. Most of you probably already have been in a leadership position, or you're in one with your job, you're in one with your school, maybe you're in one with your church. Being a parent is a leadership position that I'm sure many people over the last few months have gained a lot of new skills in. Some of the qualities that I found across the board when looking at successful leaders were perseverance. When you come up against that brick wall and it's hard and you don't know if you can get over it, but you keep striving. Determination, which goes hand in hand with that. Being instinctual. Sometimes we want to look at a problem from every angle, and although that's not a bad habit to have, there's nothing wrong with trusting your instincts too. And the more we grow comfortable in doing that, sometimes the more successful we are. Being accountable. Everyone's going to make mistakes. We make mistakes all the time in our everyday life, and as a leader, you're going to make mistakes too. Being accountable and accepting ownership when things don't go right, and then learning from those mistakes is incredibly important. Being prepared. Although as great as it is to trust your instincts, as I said, preparation is key. You always want to make sure that you're prepared to tackle a problem, that you're not going in completely blind, that you know the different angles of the issues that are up ahead of you. And be bold. Sometimes taking the hard step, the step that isn't easy, that may not be popular, but is right, is incredibly important. There are many things that leaders throughout our history have done at the time that were very unpopular with the masses, but over time, they're looked at as, game-changing moments in American history. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, obviously not popular in the South, but in the North too, was not the most popular decision at the time, but it was the right one. And we certainly look back, over 150 years later, and there's no question that that was the bold, right decision. At the time, didn't necessarily earn him a ton of fans. All right, so let's move into our actual examples. The first person I'm going to talk to you about today is John F. Kennedy, who was born in 1917 and died in 1963. So the facts on him. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, one of 9 children, born into great privilege, incredibly wealthy family. He was the youngest US president to be elected. He was elected at age 43. One of the reasons I put such emphasis there on to be elected was Theodore Roosevelt was actually the youngest person to serve as president, but he took over after McKinley's assassination at the age of 41. So Kennedy's the youngest to be elected. He was severely injured in World War II when his PT boat, he was in the Navy, PT 109 was hit. He received the Purple Heart and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. That's the highest medal you can achieve in the Navy for his service there in World War II. He went on to serve in the US Congress and serve in the Senate from the state of Massachusetts. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. So the leadership crucible that we're going to look at with him is twofold. And the first part of it is the Bay of Pigs invasion. So what was that? It was a failed invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles that we had been financing through the CIA, and we had been training them. We were training them in Guatemala. So when Fidel Castro, his revolution was successful, and he and his communist revolutionaries took over Cuba, the US was not very happy at having a communist neighbor 90 miles from their coast. Obviously, Russia's very happy to have that, so we don't want to directly get involved in anything in Cuba, because that's going to incur the wrath of Russia. So we are covertly training these exiles who want to go in and take their country back, but we can't be held responsible for any of it, because it's not us, it's these exiles. The whole plan was begun under the Eisenhower administration, so the presidency before Kennedy took office. And it was put into action by Kennedy on April 17, 1961, so just a few months after he took over. The CIA presents him with, hey, here's what we've been doing. We've trained these people. We want to get them into Cuba. We believe that they can be successful. They can overthrow the Cuban government. It was a terrible plan. It was not well thought through. And there were numerous little things that helped make it unsuccessful. The weather, the planes that we provided were seen coming miles away. So the Cubans are waiting on the beach at the Bay of Pigs. And the Bay of Pigs is the actual name of the bay there in Cuba that they landed. There's wholesale slaughter. They were absolutely ready for them. So they killed a ton of people. They took the rest prisoner. The CIA believed that once the exiles were on the ground, if we saw that they were being overwhelmed, that Kennedy would call for U.S. air support to go in and intervene. They believed they could box him in, that ultimately, once he made the call to do this, if it wasn't successful, even though we didn't want to be directly involved, he'd go ahead and do it. They banked wrong there because he absolutely refused to provide that air support. There was also the loss of 4 U.S. lives in this. We did have some U.S. troops covertly helping in this mission. 4 of them died. It did not take rocket scientists to see that, this was a cloak and dagger U.S. mission. It added greatly to tension with Russia, just heating up this Cold War even more. It was a colossal failure for Kennedy, who many, when he was running for president, said he's so young, he's so inexperienced, he's not ready for something like this. A leader like Russia had, and Khrushchev is going to eat him alive. And this kind of fed into all of those critics in regards to what they felt he would be able to accomplish as president. So I have a short video clip that is going to talk about the Bay of Pigs very briefly. Okay, so the really cool thing with that was he came out and admitted he was wrong, that he was the responsible party, and that everything anybody had bad to say about this falls on him because it was his call. We don't see people do that as often today, whether it's, within work, friendships, sometimes even marriages. Owning up to your mistakes can be hard, saying, hey, you know what? It was me. I was wrong. It's a hard thing to do, and it earned him a lot of trust with the American people. He took a lot of these lessons that he learned there with the Bay of Pigs into something that would come up in 1962, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most of you are probably a little more familiar with that. I think it's more broadly known. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was basically as simple as Russia was placing missile sites in Cuba that would have the ability to reach just about anywhere along the East Coast, I believe all the way up to Toronto, and as far west as Chicago. That's in great violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is, European powers are not to interfere on this side of the hemisphere. But naturally, we don't want missiles pointed right at us. So we found this out through our spy planes. So Russia didn't know right away that we knew. And we began very tense back and forth communications with Russia over how to deal with this, and came right on the verge of nuclear war. If JFK had just flat out listened to his generals, military chiefs of staff that were advising him during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would have been in war, because none of them recommended, a quarantine, which is what we ended up doing, where no more ships could get into Cuba, let alone diplomatic negotiations. He took the lessons that he learned and just blindly listening to his generals in the Bay of Pigs into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And thankfully, because of those lessons that he learned from with his first mistake, we were able to avoid what could have been a nuclear holocaust. So this video is going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Hey, John, we were unable to hear the first video, and we're not hearing sound with this one either.
Okay, just a moment. All right, so what I'm going to do is go back to that first video because it's only about a minute, and I'm going to play that one, and then we can go into the Cuban Missile Crisis one. So, Chris, if you could just give me a "we're good" when I start playing this to let me know you can hear it.
Well, Jack Kennedy wakes up in the morning as the Bay of Pigs is failing, and he's in tears. I mean, he knows how terrible this is. He's crying. But he does a great thing. He takes responsibility. He goes out to the press, and he gives a famous line that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan, and I am responsible. His poll ratings went up to about 90%.
Okay, so could everyone hear that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, let's move to the video that I was showing you. I apologize about that.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
It's an exhibit in which we really tell the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was certainly the most dangerous episode in human history. And we tell it by putting you inside the room where the president and his advisors were actually dealing with the crisis.
This is a result of the photography taken Sunday, sir. How do you know this is a medium-range ballistic missile? Sir.
In the spring of 1962, Khrushchev decided to deploy a nuclear strike force in Cuba, 90 miles away from the United States. On the 14th of October, planes with cameras flying over Cuba found evidence of the missile site construction. President Kennedy was shown that evidence. He immediately called his advisors together. For the next 13 days, they tried to find a way to get those missiles out.
It's ready to be fired.
The exhibit includes original documents, artifacts, photographs, but also tapes that were secretly recorded by President Kennedy in the cabinet room while he was meeting with his advisors.
This blockade and political action I see leading into war. It'll lead right into war. This is almost as bad as the achievement of Topeka.
They're extraordinary historical records of what happened.
So we're doing a pretty bad fix at the present time. They're having a pretty bad fix.
There's really nothing to reveal why the president created those tapes. Some historians say it's because he wanted them as he prepared his memoirs, but we just don't know. We introduce the characters of Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, and Fidel Castro in Cuba by way of personality studies that were conducted by the CIA. We have the chairs that President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev sat in, the one and only time they met officially, which was in Vienna in 1961. There's a document in the exhibit in which the president is announcing an airstrike on the missile sites in Cuba. It was never delivered, but it was prepared at a time when the president was trying to decide which course of action to pursue. We have a map that was used during the briefings, and we have in Kennedy's own hands where he marked where the missile site installations were. And it just gives you an extra dose of reality about the humanity of these people.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
Ultimately, it was resolved when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The United States pledged not to invade Cuba, and secretly they promised that missiles that they had in Turkey would also be removed. The last piece of the exhibit is the original signed nuclear test ban treaty. Both nations started working toward agreement on limiting nuclear weapons. The two powers did sign the limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. No achievement ever gave the president more satisfaction.
Okay, so that's it for John F. Kennedy, which I do feel like that is the best example I have to give you for accountability and learning from your mistakes, because everything that happened with him as it pertains to the Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct result of what he learned with the Bay of Pigs. So next I'm going to talk to you about Thurgood Marshall. He was born in 1908 and died in 1993. So the facts on him: he was born in Baltimore, Maryland. As a young child, always wanted to be a lawyer. It was always his hope to do that, mainly because he wanted to affect positive change for people just like him, because he saw so much injustice growing up in Baltimore, in that early 20th century time period. He was rejected from many law schools flat out because of his race. He graduated from Lincoln University and then Howard University. He was the chief counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So what the Legal Defense Fund did was, if you were an African American and you needed help, you'd been unjustly charged with something or unjustly convicted with something, and you needed legal help, they would step in and provide that free of charge. Marshall, early in his career, was all over the country, constantly traveling, taking these cases in areas where he certainly was not welcomed. He was viewed as an outsider, viewed as an intruder, viewed as an instigator, because in many of these communities, they considered these cases done and over with, that, they had convicted these people, that there was nothing more to talk about. And obviously, if you go and you look at the rate that he was able to get convictions overturned, or how many people he was able to get off, it shows that they were far from done and over with. That with the proper representation and showing of the facts, most of these people were innocent of everything, or in cases where they weren't found completely innocent, the charges were much less. He argued 32 cases in front of the US Supreme Court, winning 29 of them, which is an incredible ratio, especially when you consider that this was a Supreme Court that had plenty of people that were less than open-minded when it came to race, and they had an African-American lawyer arguing in front of them. He served on the US Court of Appeals, and as the Solicitor General, he was appointed in that position by President Lyndon Johnson, and he would go on to be the first African American on the US Supreme Court. He was appointed into that position by Lyndon Johnson. So the moment that we're going to zoom in on with him is the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, which is, of course, where racial segregation in public schooling was overturned. Marshall was the lead counsel in that case, and that was a 1954 unanimous decision in the US Supreme Court that stated separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. One of the things to focus on in that statement is the unanimous decision. That was not easy to reach, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time felt that for this decision to carry the full weight that it needed to, for people across the country, whether you were in a northern state, and there were plenty of northern states that, were not the most welcoming to the idea of integrated schooling, as well as the South, that you've got to go ahead and do this. It's a unanimous decision. There's no vacillation on it. There's, a rock solid decision that we all agree with. That wasn't easy to get, but they did. There was a lot of back and forth as that decision was being made to get all of the justices to agree and to make it unanimous. It made school segregation unconstitutional and began the process of desegregation in all areas of American life, not just schooling, but, buses, trains, restaurants. It's not like this decision flipped a switch and everything was great, but it started a ball rolling. Unfortunately, when it came to school segregation, it continued well into the 70s. You could make a case even into the 80s in certain areas like Prince Edward County in Virginia, where basically they shuttered their public schools and went to a completely private school situation to avoid integration. So it didn't make everything better overnight. There's still issues when it comes to equality in schooling today, but it was the first step that was needed. And it was a dangerous step for Marshall to take. By this point, 1954, he's already one of the most famous lawyers in the nation. He could have stepped back from his work with the NAACP, went into private practice, and just started making money. This decision made him a marked man throughout the country, especially in the South. But he did it anyway, and he did it because it was right. So here is a short clip talking about Thurgood Marshall, and more specifically, the Brown versus Board of Education decision.
When the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the 1954 Brown decision mandating the desegregation of America's public schools, it was a major victory for civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall. But no one, not even the justices, knew what would happen in the South. It didn't take long to find out.
A few border states accepted the Brown decision with good faith, but in much of the South there was to be the massive resistance for a decade and more.
We intend to maintain separate schools in Georgia, one way or another, come what may.
We're going to retain segregated schools, and we're not going to pay any attention to a political decision by an incompetent political court.
When the NAACP attorneys won the Brown decision, they ended the legal basis for segregation and set the South on fire. For Thurgood Marshall, Brown was the final leg in a heroic journey to end segregation.
Last night, less than an hour after Judge Grooms' decision,
you never knew what would happen the next day or indeed the next hour.
this same board expelled Miss Lucy.
No guilty person ever gets hurt. The innocent people get hurt.
For 20 years, he traveled hundreds of thousands of miles through war and depression in the Jim Crow South, fighting case by case, setting precedent after precedent for one of the most important legal decisions in American history.
This was a man who created opportunity for so many people in this country and improved their lives. I would call him a hero. I would call him the greatest lawyer of the 20th century.
Okay, so that's what I've got on Thurgood Marshall. I love that quote there that we had above the video with him, which is, "You do what you think is right and let the law catch up." I think that's a great quote. Moving on, we're going to talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was born in 1882 and died in 1945. He was born in Hyde Park, New York, like JFK, born into a family of great wealth. He was a member of the New York State Senate. This is when he was very young. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Woodrow Wilson administration, so that was during World War I. He was very pleased to hold that position because it was a position that his second cousin Theodore Roosevelt had previously held. He ran unsuccessfully for vice president in 1920 with presidential candidate James Cox. In between here, he was stricken with a paralytic illness that was most likely polio, but he would bounce back from pretty much thinking his career was over when that diagnosis happened, to serve as governor of New York. And then he was the only person elected to more than 2 terms as US president. Being elected to 4, didn't really get to serve too much of that 4th one before passing away. So the issues that we're going to talk with about him, way more than just one. So there's the polio that I mentioned, there's the Great Depression, and there's World War II. So he contracted this paralytic illness. As I said, it was probably polio, but there's research now that perhaps it was Guillain-Barré syndrome. Contracted that in 1921 and was left paralyzed from the waist down. He gained a measure of recovery and certainly his confidence, because emotionally he was broken by this diagnosis. He viewed his life as being over. He was able to regain a little bit of mobility, but mostly his confidence. At Warm Springs, Georgia, he went down there because, it's well known for a long time that hot springs have some properties that help when it comes to mobility, pain, inflammation, things of that nature. He had to still, when he was able to walk, it was only with braces and very short distances, and usually with assistance. For the most part, he would still be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He began his presidency during the worst economic crisis in US history, which was the Great Depression. And the way that he attacked that was instituting social programs, public work projects, and financial reforms that were known as the New Deal. So when you see things like Social Security, you see things like the building of the Hoover Dam, those were all things to try and get the country moving again, to pull people up some, because it was a very terrible situation that he walked into. In 1941, by then he's been president nearly a decade, Pearl Harbor is attacked and the US enters World War II. He guided the United States through the majority of World War II and worked with world leaders to create a post-war world where hopefully wars of the scale that we saw there would never happen again, laying the blocks for things like the United Nations and NATO that would eventually come to pass. So here's a brief video about Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt steps into the worst economic crisis in the history of the world when he's president. So he's a man who's got a lot of challenges.
The nation was in trouble. The danger was not just that capitalism would fail, but if capitalism failed, it would bring down representative democracy with it.
His first contribution was to say, I have a plan to fix this. And his New Deal legislation helped create economic stability and lay the foundation for an economic renaissance that continued for decades and decades after he left office.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The second great crisis that Roosevelt faces is World War II. He realizes very early on that the U.S. will get involved in this war. And so the question for him is, how does he get the American people on board?
What made Franklin Roosevelt a great leader was his visionary ability to make the case for his ideas.
I want to talk with you about a number of subjects that directly affect the future of the United States.
President Roosevelt came in at the right time to take advantage of this new technology called radio that could broadcast his voice all over the country, and was able to use that tool to win over voters.
I think it's very difficult to identify one leadership quality that's responsible for his success. But I think that I would point to his ability to rely on others. He has the wisdom and confidence to know he needs a brains trust, that he can't solve all the problems of the Depression on his own.
He looked all over the country, and he brought to Washington the smartest people he could find.
When we think about what kind of person Franklin Roosevelt is, I think one of the things that strikes me most is the stretch that he had to make to go from being a wealthy patrician American to being this man who understood the poorest, most dejected American worker on the street. And to have them think, to believe that he understands them.
Franklin Roosevelt bequeathed to the working people of this nation, to the poor, to people of color, to immigrants, a sense that the government was theirs and the government was going to look after them and do the best for them.
When you think about what Franklin Roosevelt was able to accomplish, what he was able to guide the nation through during those terms as president, and combine it with what he himself personally dealt with every day, it's really quite remarkable. So next we have Susan B. Anthony. She was born in 1820 and died in 1906. So about her, she was born in Adams, Massachusetts, but she was raised and resided in Rochester, New York, which is where she would live for the rest of her life. She was very active in the abolitionist movement in the antebellum era of America, so before slavery was declared unconstitutional. She was involved in the temperance movement. So the temperance movement, which is the movement to abolish alcohol, was kind of like the precursor to the women's rights movement. The thought of women standing up and saying, hey, we deserve equal rights, was so almost unthinkable in the early 19th century that the temperance movement instead is where women first began to speak up, because they were basically saying, hey, if we have to be completely obedient to the men in our lives, listening to everything that they say, you know, to the point that punishment is legal should we not, how about they not be stone cold drunk all the time? That's where the temperance movement started, was why should we have to listen to these people when they're not even of sound mind because they're so overindulgent in drink? And the temperance movement led directly into the women's rights struggle, which she was a leading figure of, not only the equal rights, but also the right to vote, because that's where a lot of it starts and ends. We deserve the same say in who represents us, who makes the decisions and the law in this country as anyone else. She typically gave 75 to 100 speeches a year all around the country. She was arrested very famously for voting in her hometown of Rochester while women voting was still not legal. The 19th Amendment, which was passed after she had passed away, giving women suffrage, unofficially carries her name. It's unofficially known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So women's suffrage obviously is the critical juncture, the moment in her life struggle that she's most known for. So what was that? Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott convened the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. So they were the two pioneers when it comes to the women's rights movement. And this convention drafted something called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was basically a women's Bill of Rights, laying out what was missing when it came to the rights of women in the United States and what needed to be remedied. In 1878, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony drafted that amendment to the Constitution that would grant women the right to vote. Obviously, it was not passed. It was problematic for the representatives and government even presenting it. It was so quickly voted down. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed in 1890 with Susan B. Anthony at its head. What that did was take a bunch of disparate groups around the country of women's rights advocates and form them under one umbrella, one wing, to kind of consolidate their power. Western states began to grant women the right to vote in the late 19th, early 20th century. Some of that could be they were a little bit more progressive thinking. Out in the West, certainly it was a hard scrabble life. Women pulled their weight the same as any man, and oftentimes were running ranches completely on their own. So at that point, how can you look around and say, well, women don't deserve the right to vote? There were women in Colorado that were some of the biggest employers in the state because of the ranches that they owned and they ran. So how do you tell them they can't vote? That was where the momentum really started and began to roll back east. In the early 20th century, between 5,000 and 8,000 women protested down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This got worldwide attention. If we look at the March on Washington in the 1960s and how it's viewed as this critical moment in African American struggle for equal rights, this protest down Pennsylvania Avenue in the 19-teens, it was during the Woodrow Wilson administration, pretty much the same type of moment for the women's rights movement. The onset of World War I, when women had to take over while men went and fought the war, the same jobs that the men were doing without any lag in production, without the economy slowing, proving that they can do the exact same work. That helped propel the 19th Amendment to get presented again and to finally be passed, giving women the right to vote in 1920. It was that same amendment, just polished up for the times, that Stanton and Anthony had written in 1878 that finally passed, giving that right to vote in 1920. So there's a quote here that I liked by Susan B. Anthony: "There never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make the laws and elect the lawmakers." And here's a brief video on her.
B. Anthony was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She was one of 6 children. Her father owned a successful cotton mill and sent Susan and one of her sisters to private school. But 6 months after she started school, her father's business failed and he lost everything he owned. Susan had to quit school and go to work to help support her family. At the time, women weren't allowed to own property, so Susan's mother had everything she possessed taken away as well. Women in the 1800s were also not allowed to attend many of the schools men could. They didn't get paid the same salaries as men, nor could they vote. Men thought that women were not capable of making smart decisions. Susan was very bothered by this and decided the laws and ideas of the United States needed to change. By this time, she was the principal of a school and managed her father's farm. She knew women were as capable as men and should be given the same opportunities. She was also deeply opposed to slavery and felt African Americans shouldn't be denied these rights either. She found other women who felt the same way she did, and they organized the National Women's Suffrage Association. The word suffrage means having the right to vote in political elections. Susan wrote speeches, letters, petitions to the government and newspapers with the goal of securing rights, especially the right to vote, for women. She was once arrested and fined $100 for illegally voting in a presidential election. Sadly, at the time of Susan's death in 1906, the law had not been changed. But women did not stop the work of suffrage, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed that guarantees all citizens, men and women, the right to vote. In 1979, the government remembered and honored Susan B. Anthony and her work for women's rights by issuing a $1 coin featuring her picture.
One of the things that stands out to me about Susan B. Anthony is we live in a society and a culture where we all want to be liked. And that's just a fact. Nobody likes being hated. And if we look back at those initial leadership qualities that I talked about in the beginning, one of them was be bold. Susan B. Anthony chose a life where she was almost universally hated, scorned, and ridiculed everywhere that she went in this country. And she bore that with grace throughout the entirety of her life and did not even live long enough to see that hope that she fought for come to fruition. That's boldness. Finally, we're going to talk about John McCain. He was born in 1936 and died in 2018. So the facts on him: he was born in Coco Solo, Panama Canal Zone, while his father was stationed there. Both his father and his grandfather were admirals in the Navy. He graduated himself from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1958 and was immediately commissioned into the Navy as a naval aviator. He began combat operations in Vietnam in 1967. He specifically requested to be placed into combat operations. During this time, his father was the admiral in charge for the entire Pacific theater, of which the Vietnam conflict was obviously the focus. After that, he served 2 terms as a congressman from Arizona and then 31 years as a senator from Arizona. He was a presidential nominee in the years 2000 and 2008. So the critical moment in his life, and as I'm sure he would say, the critical moment that defined so much of the rest of his life, was being a prisoner of war during the Vietnam conflict. So McCain was shot down over Hanoi, Vietnam, while on a bombing mission on October 26, 1967. While in the process of being shot down, he broke both arms and one leg and nearly drowned after he ejected from his plane. The impact was so great on that. When he was recovered by Vietnam forces, they crushed his shoulder with a rifle, stabbed him with a bayonet. At this point, they didn't realize the high value capture that they had captured the son of the naval commander for this entire theater of war. Once they did realize that, they made sure that they didn't want to kill him, but made his life very uncomfortable, because how great would it be if they could get this son of their enemy to denounce the United States, to denounce his country, to denounce what they were doing there. He suffered incredible physical and mental torture, repeated beatings, 2 years in solitary confinement. He finally, at a breaking point, admitted to being an air pirate. That was the most they could get out of him, was for him to say that he was an air pirate. And certainly when you consider everything that he had been put through, was going through, and would still go through, I don't think anybody can fault him for that. He refused an early out-of-sequence release as peace talks were finally happening, instead going with what is the tradition, which is you are released in the order in which you were taken prisoner. In total, he was held as a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. Despite his years as a prisoner, McCain worked to normalize relations with Vietnam. He did this for a multitude of reasons. The first was to see if there were any POWs still in Vietnam and to get them back home. And then once he, along with other veterans such as John Kerry and others within Congress, were satisfied that there were no Americans left in Vietnam, they did work to normalize those relations when it came to trade, commerce, and diplomacy with Vietnam. So a quote from McCain, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act despite our fears." And certainly in the situation that he found himself there, how could you not have fears? It's hard to imagine suffering, the degradations, both mental and physical, that he was facing and not crack. And here's a brief video about his time as a POW.
U.S. Senator John McCain was diagnosed with glioblastoma, brain cancer, in July 2017. But an uncertain prognosis wasn't the first battle McCain faced. McCain's father and grandfather were both 4-star admirals in the Navy, and he followed in their footsteps, attending the Naval Academy at Annapolis. McCain is often described as being a rebellious young man. He was among the few proud members of the Century Club, those who earned more than 100 demerits in a year. McCain graduated in 1958 and became a naval aviator. His real battles with adversity would begin several years later.
Retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
McCain was flying in a mission over Hanoi in October 1967 when his A-4 Skyhawk was shot down.
One of the great things about being a fighter pilot is you're sure that everybody else is going to get shot down, but not you.
He was captured and held as a prisoner of war. Defiance became a vital tool for McCain to survive the physically and psychologically harsh conditions of confinement at Hoa La Prison, nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton.
I was on a flight over the city of Hanoi, and I was bombing and was hit by either missile or anti-aircraft fire. I'm not sure. And I was picked up by some North Vietnamese and taken to the hospital where I almost died.
Historians have said that no American prisoner arrived at the Hanoi Hilton in worse condition than McCain.
We got pretty rough. Broke my shoulder and hurt my knee again. And when you're in a war and you're captured by the enemy, you can't expect, to have tea.
They demanded information in exchange for medical care, but McCain refused and was left for dead, until one of the men discovered he was the son of an admiral. For 9 months, McCain repeatedly refused to give his captors information, but eventually broke when he was put in the ropes, a torture system that bent and warped the body. McCain relented and signed a statement calling himself an air pirate. Afterwards, he tried to hang himself with his shirt before a guard intervened. In total, McCain would spend more than 5 years in captivity. Along with his fellow prisoners, McCain managed small triumphs over his captors. They communicated through taps and knocks to help each other endure brutal solitary confinement. In one incident, McCain shouted obscenities at visiting North Vietnamese dignitaries. That act of defiance earned McCain 2 years in solitary confinement. McCain and 590 other POWs were released in 1973. The Vietnam War officially ended in 1975.
Well, the great honor of my life it was to serve in the company of heroes. I'm not a hero.
Okay, Okay, so that's everything that I have as far as examples for you guys. So this is the point typically where I open it up if you would like to provide an example of your own that we can all talk about, or if you have questions. So let me go ahead and escape out of that. Do any of you have questions?
I have one, John.
Okay.
How did you select these specific people for your presentation?
I thought back and I wanted to get kind of a cross section of people and time periods. I wanted people where I could pinpoint one specific really major event in United States history. Or in the case of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I could not define it to just one event. But I wanted people, I came up with the list of characteristics first, and I wanted people that exemplified all or most of those in the situation that we could talk about. And it was not easy to narrow it down to 5. Basically, we reached a point where I timed it out and knew how many I could have. So that's how I chose them.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I don't have any in the chat either.
Okay. Chris, did you have some stuff you needed to say before we close up shop?
Yeah, so since this is being recorded, we do have the entry drawing for the iPad, AirPods, and Nintendo Switch for all of our students. I'm going to put that slide up. Just make sure that you go to that URL before Monday, August 24th, because we're going to announce the winners on that date. And then make sure that you attend some of the other summer sessions that will continue through the month of July and also August. And John, thank you very much for your time today. It was a really awesome presentation.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
It was great, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Really, really great.
Really awesome. Good. Thank you, BJ. Thank you, Sarah. All right, well, I'm going to head out. Chris, thank you for setting all of this up, and Sarah for your idea to do it. It's a good opportunity for our students to learn and still feel engaged during this really weird time we're all having.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, have a good weekend.
Thanks for being our guinea pig.
No problem.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
So again, if you're watching this as a recording, please make sure that you go to the following link. Make sure that you do it before Monday, August 24th, 2020. We will be doing the drawing that morning and announcing it in our weekly email that day. That'll be the first day of fall classes. So make sure to check that email, and you'll also receive an email from engage@lfcc.edu if you are one of our winners. Again, this is for the drawing for the iPad, AirPods, or Nintendo Switch.